And again, we're not talking about, I don't think he's talking about changing things just for change's sake. Hey, we're changing stuff. No, we're always staying focused on the mission. Before we do all these changes, kind of the fuel behind them is we ought to ask ourselves, what would we never change? Hey guys, thank you for joining me today for our discussion. We're going to be looking at the fall issue, 2005 Leadership Journal. So as the filming of this video about 20 years ago. This is an article entitled, Even Healthy Churches Need to Change. And the article comes from H. Dale Burke. Now, Dale Burke followed a much more famous, more popular person, Charles Swindoll or Chuck Swindoll. Chuck Swindoll's insight for living broadcast on the radio was heard nationwide and internationally. He was the pastor at the First Free Church in Fullerton, California, Evangelical Free Church. And then he left that position and retired after maybe 30 years there and became the president of Dallas Theological Seminary. And immediately following Swindoll was H. Dale Burke. And H. Dale Burke stayed at the church for 15 years and now is involved in some level at the making of this video at Rock Point Church. So he had an extensive ministry himself, and the church continued to grow. Now the article begins with Burke saying, only an idiot would follow Chuck Swindoll. I mean, Chuck Swindoll is, a master preacher and a master teacher, and it's overwhelming to try to follow in somebody's shoes like that. And that's how the article starts, is he just kind of put his head down and did his best, and the church continued to grow. Obviously, like every transition, there's going to be some losses, but the church grew because it was very healthy. And so this article is about the importance of church health. And while, we may often get fixated on building and numbers and growth and all of those good things, it's important to stay focused on what makes a church healthy and making sure that we maintain church health. But the point of this article is even healthy churches, like the one in Fullerton, need to be able to embrace innovation, creativity, adapting, and change in their environments. So I just want to hit a couple of highlights from this article and talk about it with you. He says that they were never like really the model for an emerging church. Remember back at that time, that term emerging was, really popular for churches. Very seeker-driven, very tuned in and cued in with the culture. And he says, we were never really that, but we were a very healthy church at our core. We had a fresh, mission-driven vision, and, we had this strong historic background, and we had some good kingdom-minded initiatives, and but we needed a fresh perspective, and we needed to have a spirit that was forward-thinking, creative, and unified. And that, is a great statement for all of us, as we want that for our churches. It says, in today's culture, now remember, if it was true then, it's probably more apparent now in our day and age. But in today's culture, every church needs a change-friendly environment that welcomes innovation and creativity. Nothing ever needs to be dismantled and discarded just because it exists. You don't just go through and wipe out effective ministries or productive ministries, but everything we should be willing to challenge every ministry in our church and ask, is this really essential? Is this really necessary? Is it really productive? Just because it's popular or just because it's always been that way or it was started by somebody that we all love and remember doesn't mean that this is what we ought to be doing as a church. And so we have to be forward thinking and focused on the mission. Of course, the mission is to reach people for the kingdom. And, one of the things that he says is, even if 99% of the world had responded to the gospel, we ought to be willing to do anything, short of sin. We ought to be willing to do anything required in order to reach that last 1%. And, that's an incredible vision and an incredible urgency in relation to the gospel. He quotes Howard Hendricks, which is no surprise because when you think of Chuck Swindoll, often Howard Hendricks comes with that. Howard Hendricks was one of the professors at Dallas Theological Seminary for years and an influence on many people, especially Swindoll. He says, if it isn't broke, then break it. That's one of the quotes from Howard Hendricks. If it isn't broke, break it. And, not necessarily that you just try to dismantle and destroy things, but break it apart and analyze it and ask yourself, is this really working for us? Is this really being productive? And if it's not, then we got to evaluate, do we spend any more time or attention on this, or maybe we need to move on to some other strategy. If a great church wants a future to be as exciting as its past, it must embrace change and the accompanying risks that come with it before it becomes unhealthy. And change must become a lifestyle. And again, we're not talking about, I don't think he's talking about changing things just for change's sake. Hey, we're changing stuff. No, we're always staying focused on the mission. And one of the things that he says that's, I thought, very helpful is, before we do all these changes, kind of the fuel behind them is we ought to ask ourselves, what would we never change? What are some of the core values that we would never change? Like, you may say, well, we would never change our stance on the inerrancy of the Word of God, or we would never change on our stance that all people can be saved if they would hear and respond to the gospel. So you got to decide, what is it we would never change, and then be willing to change all the rest. Be willing to innovate and be creative and be fluid with everything that is not essential. And that is a difficult challenge, but I think it's important that churches and church leaders have to decide, what are we not willing to change, and then be willing to change the rest. The majority of churches in America are plateaued or dying for one of two reasons: because they change what should never be changed, or because they refuse to change what we are free to change. And I think that's really something for each of us to think about, is, are there some changes that need to be made? And, maybe there are some obvious changes, but they haven't become obvious to us because we don't want the fights. We don't want the conflict. We don't want the problems. We know that a ministry in our church may be sucking resources and money and time and attention away from where we should be focused, but we don't want the conflict that's going to come when we raise it up in a meeting that this needs to be done because, maybe it's somebody's pet ministry, or somebody started it years ago, or and we know it's not working. And sometimes the real challenge is just to have the courage to say out loud what everybody kind of knows, but is unwilling to say. Think about David on the battlefield. Everybody knew that Goliath was a problem, but nobody would say anything. Nobody would do anything. And then David finally comes up and says, why are we accepting this? This isn't the way it should be. Why is this uncircumcised Philistine allowed to taunt the armies of the living God? And he was just willing to say out loud what others, maybe were thinking, but wouldn't say out loud. And so that willingness to pour new wine into new wineskins, to recognize, if we're going to have this kind of innovation, then maybe we need to be willing to change ourselves. And, if we're not willing to change ourselves, then what difference does it make if we try to make changes in the church? So change really begins in us, being willing to pour new wine into new wineskins, and then asking ourselves, what wineskins need to be replaced in our church? What has gotten old? What has gotten stale? What is no longer connecting to our culture? One of the things he mentions in this article is, people are always changing, and everything that people relate to is always changing. Think how much the world has changed in 20 years. Think how important cell phones are to us now, and the internet. The internet was just in its early stages back in 2005. I remember being on church staff, and if you wanted to create, an image to promote a concert or something, you had to have a specialist who understood graphics. Now you can pull up many different resources online and create graphics yourself. I think a good example of how the church changed was during COVID. Churches really increased their online presence. I know that the church took a big gut punch in attendance, and I don't know that we'll ever recover from that and see the numbers that we used to see. But so many churches struggle or go out of business during COVID. But, a lot of churches had to really decide, okay, we're going to have to put some money in our online presence. We're going to have to record these sermons, record this music, and do a lot better job creating an online presence. And that's just one example of how churches had to adapt or change. I think another thing we see right now in the last 10 years or so is the rise of satellite campuses. When smaller churches maybe can't necessarily produce the kind of results that they need to in order to stay effective and stay in business, they often reach out to larger churches and say, hey, come help us out, and the larger churches in town, end up taking them over and renovating them. I was talking to a friend of mine just a couple of months ago, and they bought out a storefront in a neighboring city to plant a new church. They're a church of 2,000 people, but they sent 130 people in, that live in this bedroom community, and they renovated a storefront and now are hosting a satellite campus of their service in that storefront. And he told me that they spent over $700,000 renovating a rental space, and now they have to pay rent every month on that. And he wasn't complaining. He was just saying, that's what it takes in order to innovate and be creative. It's going to take cost. It's going to take risk. And we got to be willing to make some of those risks. Now, maybe you can't risk $700,000. Our church couldn't either, but there's going to be a cost associated with creativity. There's going to be a cost associated with innovation. And let me just read this last thought here that the article closes with. When your memories are more exciting than your dreams, you've begun to die. And I believe that also is a quote from Howard Hendricks. But I think very fitting that when you go back and look into the past, and it feels more safe and more agreeable than your future, you've begun to die. And I think the challenge for us as church leaders, especially if your church has got any, if you're over 30, 40, 50 years old as a church, is to go back into that heritage and remind your current people of the cost, sacrifice, and dedication of the founding members of that church, and use that to inspire the people you have today. Say, these people 100 years ago when this church was planted, they had a great expense, and they had a great vision, they had great excitement, and they were willing to do what it takes. They were willing to make those risks, and here we are now 100 years later, and that's been handed to us, and we need that same vision, that same excitement, now they had a different world in many ways that they were operating in than we have today, but we can have that same excitement, that same enthusiasm, that same vision. So, fantastic article, turnaround churches and embracing change, and even healthy churches at times need to retool, reorganize, and to remember who they are and innovate and create a fresh vision for their congregation. Thank you guys. I'll see you next time.